This is the second in a 4-lecture series that we're doing this semester called Situating Sustainability. My name is Ann Rademacher. I'm an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program here. I'm also part of the Metropolitan Studies program in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. And I've had the privilege of welcoming so far now an urban ecologist to speak in the series, Mary Cadenasso, who was here last Wednesday, and now tonight Roshni Udyavar, who joins us from the Rachna Sansad Institute for Environmental Architecture in Mumbai. Before I introduce Roshni, I wanted to say a few words about what the connection between NYU Abu Dhabi and a series about sustainability or situating sustainability here at NYU, what that connection looks like. Essentially, as you're all aware, the NYU Abu Dhabi program has made a very vocal, explicit commitment to trying to develop both curricular and also cultural and built environmental life around the commitment that at this point we hope is shared throughout the university's different programs, and that is a commitment to sustainability, right? And it's one thing to make a nominal declaration of a commitment to sustainability. It's another, and an enormous challenge, to develop that programmatically in terms of our built environment, in terms of the institutional culture that we all share. And it's precisely that challenge that we were invited by NYU Abu Dhabi to explore here on NYU's New York campus by undertaking a systematic exploration of what sustainability means across a range of disciplines and across a range of positions. And so, as I said last time, we had an urban ecologist here who talked about sustainability, especially in urban contexts, from the perspective of ecosystem ecology. Tonight we have an architecture specialist, an architect, as well as an instructor of environmental architecture, to talk to us about the challenges that sustainability presents to the urban built form, and then also to talk to us about what a different cultural and geographic context throws into the conversation. Later in November, we'll welcome a guest who, as an anthropologist, will talk about the relationship between implementing urban sustainability and political instability by drawing on a case study from Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and I hope you'll join us for that. That'll be November 25th. And then the final talk in the series will be a cultural analyst who will talk to us about the challenge of building an eco-city outside of Shanghai. That's the city of Dongtan. That'll be December 2nd with Julie Zi, who'll be joining us from the University of California. So we're looking at sustainability through this series across a range of disciplines and through a range of questions. And in doing so, trying to further both the conversation and our own shared institutional understanding of what it is we at NYU are all committed to when we talk about being committed to sustainability. I want to thank the NYU Abu Dhabi program for providing both the invitation and also the support that has made this series possible. And I also want to mention that the series is being conducted in concert with a course that we're running in the Environmental Studies program this semester that's called Thinking Globally, Acting Locally, Sustainability and Social Context. And all of the students in that class are here tonight. And since they're here, and since you all who are not in the class are also here, what I'll do in just a minute is distribute or circulate a sign-in sheet. We'd like to know who's here so that we can keep in touch with you both about the series and other kinds of sustainability-related events. So I'll ask, as this goes around, invite you to list your name and your email contact, but notice at the top, one says class, Thinking Globally, Acting Locally. Those are the students in my course. And those of you that are not here from the class, please sign in on the non-class guests welcome sheet, okay? Thank you. Also, after the talk, there will be a brief reception. There is a lot of material, more information about the NYU Abu Dhabi program in the back there, and there's also more information about Rachna Sansad Institute, which Roshni Udyavar will tell us more about in just a moment. The materials from Rachna Sansad that are here tonight, there's 4 pieces, I think, 2 magazines and 2 brochures about the program. Those are not actually for distribution. They're just for display and for your perusal at the table. So if you're holding on to one of those right now as something that looks interesting to read later, please return it to the table so that others can have a look. We'll have more copies of those publications in the Environmental Studies Program Office, and I'd be happy to make those things available after the talk, okay? Now, on to our guest. We are delighted to welcome Roshni Udyavar, who's traveled all the way from Mumbai to come and talk to us tonight about challenges for green buildings in India. Roshni is quite unique. Just as I said last week, Mary Cadnaso is quite unique among urban ecologists, among ecosystem ecologists. Roshni is also incredibly unique among architects. I came to know Roshni several years back when I got an email while doing some field work in Mumbai. Got an email inviting me to come and speak about urban ecology to a class of postgraduate students. Would I talk about carrying capacity? They were looking for someone who worked on urban ecology who could talk about carrying capacity. I read through the message, of course, was more than willing to come and give a lecture. But I realized I was being invited by an institute for architecture. And I thought, that's interesting. I'm not an architect, not trained in architecture, but architects are reaching out to me with questions not about architecture, but about urban ecology and carrying capacity, ways of thinking about cities as ecosystems, and my curiosity was piqued. This began a now many years long relationship with the program in environmental architecture at Rachna Sansad, through which I've come to appreciate how innovative this particular architectural institute is. In fact, Roshni Udyavar started 7 years back India, and in fact South Asia's first formal training program in environmental architecture, in which already practicing architects come and earn a second master's degree, specifically around the question of what happens when we apply architecture to ecology. What does that training look like? And so the work that's happening there, which again started 7 years back, has now proliferated, and there are multiple environmental architecture programs that one can enroll in throughout South Asia at this point, in the major cities in India. I'll also tell you that Roshni Udyavar is an architect, she's a professor, and she's the director of this postgraduate Department of Environmental Architecture at Rachna Sansad Academy of Architecture in Mumbai. Her Institute of Environmental Architecture initiated the course curriculum for environmental architecture as a postgraduate discipline, which is, as I've just said, widely accepted now in colleges all over India. Roshni has been involved in a wide range of pedagogic and practical projects concerning the integration of knowledge and technology for green buildings, and her research focus in the last few years has been on developing indigenous rating systems, guidelines, and techniques for sustainable building models in Indian cities. She's especially interested in energy and water, and I'll let her tell you more in the context of this talk. Please join me in welcoming Roshni Udyavar.
Thanks, Anne. Distinguished faculty present here, students, colleagues, and friends, very good evening to you, and a namaste from India. It's a great pleasure to be here in New York University and to talk about a subject that is green buildings, of which I've been closely part of for the last 7 years, as Anne said, and even more, in fact, before 10 years, I would say. It's a subject that is of concern not just for India. Green buildings is not a subject just for India, but for America and for most of the world today, because buildings, as you know, have the biggest impact on our environment and ecosystem after agriculture. It was in the Habitat 2 conference in 1996, held in Istanbul, that not only we recognized that there are two things. One is to provide shelter for all. That was very, very, very significant. But secondly, that the impact of that shelter must be reduced we have to make shelter more sustainable. So that was a starting point, I think, for sustainable habitat, sustainable architecture, and so on. So here we are looking at challenges for green buildings in India. Before I start, I would like to give you a structure of what my presentation is. It's going to be divided into 4 parts. The first part will look at India, India's architectural heritage, its vernacular architecture, the urbanization and what's happening in terms of growth and everything. And the second part will look at the green building movement, the various rating systems that have come up in the last 5 years, I would say. The third part would look at what environmental architecture is beyond the rating systems. And the last part would be looking at challenges that we face in this field. So let me begin with India. And there are many parts that this subject I may not be able to cover in this lecture, but we can definitely have a discussion on this. So let's begin with India. It's a massive country, but compared to yours, it's just 1/3 the size. It is divided into 28 states and 7 union territories. Mostly, they are separated based on languages. And it has a very, very diverse terrain. It has 7,000 kilometers of coastline. It has a mountainous terrain, including the highest peaks. And it has, in the center, it has the plains. It has many, many rivers on the north and northeast, including the mighty Ganges. We have the Western Ghats on the west coast of India, which bring us the very precious monsoons, the huge precipitation that we receive. So we have a very diverse terrain, and to go with it, a diversity of people, almost 1.1 billion people who live here in different climatic zones. So that definitely affects the kind of architecture that we have here. And these are the different climatic zones that people live in. If you look at the architectural heritage of India, it is as old as 5,000 years. We know that the Mohenjo-daro and Harappan civilizations, the Indus Valley civilization as we know it, goes all the way back to 5,000 years. And it has been known for its very advanced planning, the kind of drainage system that they had, the kind of urban design that existed in the city was kind of very unique. But I think what is important for us here to look at in the context of green buildings is to look at some of the vernacular architecture. So we will, in the next few slides, look at some of the buildings or the cities or urban design of India in terms of its varying climatic zones. So this is a picture of Jaisalmer. Jaisalmer is a city in western part of India, Rajasthan, around the desert area, which is built in the 12th century. It is founded almost in 1196 or something. And it, as you can see, it is built inside a fort on the leeward side of a mountain so that, to prevent the harsh desert winds. And if you have a closer look at it, we see a kind of a texture about it, which is very, very meaningful as we go into the details. You can see on the left-hand side the kind of shared walls that are there, the internal courtyards, the small openings, the thick insulated flat roofs. They're very, very specific to this particular region. So it's very important to look at the greenness of these buildings, the vernacular architecture of India, especially in the context of the modern movement. On the left, on the right, you see these pathways, which were also part of this huge city. It is interesting to know these narrow pathways were just 4 meters wide, and they provided mutual shading, and they were also helpful because it provided security to people in a place which was constantly invaded. It also was more than a pathway, it was a social meeting ground for people. So we can see numerous different colors to a city which was planned so many years ago. And we see that it has so many different ways of designing it. Even as you see the facade of buildings on the street, you will see that each house was designed individually, but at the same time there is a homogeneity about it. And there was intricate design patterns that developed, the artistic aspect of it, the architectural aspect of it, and even the the trade aspect. The lower half was always used for business, and the upper half was used for the upper part was usually used by the people, the residents. So it's more kind of open, and the lower part is more of kind of closed. And also, one of the most important aspects is the internal courtyard. This is a picture of the internal courtyard, where you will see the interesting fenestrations, the openings that we have. Nowadays, when we design openings, we rarely give so much thought to it. But this is another picture of a fenestration in Rajasthan, where we see these very beautiful artwork, and it was designed for so many things. It provided light, it provided ventilation, it provided a view of the outside world in a society which was rather conservative, and it avoided the dust of the desert. Another picture of bungas, as we call it in Rajasthan, these rounded adobe huts made out of mud and use a lot of lime. And of course, the rounded shapes had to do a lot with the surface area to volume ratio, because they provided the best means of avoiding heat gain. And the insulating straw roof and many other things. The materials were basically local, and they had a lot to do with whatever was available was used, and at the same time it suited the climate. So it has evolved over several years. So what we call as vernacular architecture is not designed by an architect, it is designed by people over several years just because of their experience. A view on the right here shows the interior of such a building, of such a house. And you can see they used a variety of things, like mirrors were used in the design and very artistically used. And they had these walls painted in lime, painted white, so that the space looked larger than it was actually. And overall, a lot of research is now being done on the kind of materials that were used, because we now just consider adobe bricks or something, but the combination of the various materials that were used, for example, inside, like they used red mud, they used various other local elements, like even gemstones were used. And the combination provided low emissivity inside, which we now look at when we study building physics, but it was done many years ago, and it is vanishing if we do not preserve them. This is a picture of it in plan. And what is interesting to note here is that these various parts of the house are integrated by a wall. In the plan, if you see here, this is the wall. And this essentially is known as the courtyard. The courtyard is a central place where people work in the houses. And it is a part of every vernacular architecture, almost every part of India. You will find courtyards of different sizes, of different shapes, but even of different materials, but they have existed all over India. And it is a very interesting study to see how these courtyards function, what was their purpose, and how they were developed climatically for a country like this. Religious places like temples always were built around courtyards, or maybe in the center of courtyards. What essentially they did was to provide diffuse natural light for the houses, number one. They provided shading for the interior spaces. Usually, as you saw, they were built around verandas, which acted like buffer spaces. They provided ventilation to the inner spaces. As you can see from these two pictures, the top one shows a stack effect, which provides ventilation to the rooms around the courtyard, and the bottom one shows a radiative cooling technique, by which the cool air gets accumulated in the courtyard and provides coolness to the rooms around it. So there are these techniques that we are analyzing, but these and many other things were there in our vernacular architecture. This is a typical Chettinad house in the south of India in Kerala, and we can see a beautiful courtyard. Another important feature of vernacular architecture is the sloping roofs, and we see here that the sloping roofs also, like the courtyard, varied in style in different parts of India, and they've had various functions, like using the stack effect, or they just extracted the local prevailing breeze. It was common throughout India. The slopes varied based on precipitation, based on the amount of heat in different places, but the material was ceramics, simply whatever was available and it is the best insulating material in a climate like this. Also interesting to note is the kind of the stone columns that are there, which are locally available. Most of the materials were locally found. Also interesting to know is the kind of detailed joinery work. We always, in the modern green building rating system, we say we should not use toxic materials and so on. It is interesting to note that all these buildings did not use any adhesives, any toxic adhesives. They just relied on joinery work. So a lot of it is really very, very, green, I would say. And before we go into the next part, which is about the urbanization and the growth and in Indian cities, I would just like to summarize about vernacular architecture, especially in the context of building physics. They had three principles basically they followed, in which they made buildings more comfortable for the people who lived inside. One was mass, that is using thick walls, which provided a time lag for the heat gain. Barrier, which would be either a chhajja or, as you saw, the sloping roofs or the buffer spaces in between. And lastly, the drain, which is, usually having a water body next to a house. Nowadays, we rely on an air conditioning system, which is exactly opposite of it, which is called as a pump, which actually pumps out the heat. But what we used earlier was a drain. So it is interesting to note these things. And now coming to the modern Mumbai. This is a picture of Mumbai, which, like other cities, is growing at a very fast rate of 3%. And we have a booming construction industry here, which contributes to the GDP in a big way. This is also a picture of Mumbai, which shows huge amount of slums. And it is estimated that of the 28% of population of India which lives in cities, almost 55% live in slums and squatters. So there's not adequate housing or good standard of life. And we have a huge shortage of housing, that is 26 million units. Of course, this is a gross underestimate. We need much more housing, good quality housing. Just to give you a kind of comparison, with various other cities, we see that India is very high on population with very minimal per capita income as compared to some of these other places. So it is in this context that we have the green buildings that are happening in the last 5 years. It has just happened in the last 5 years. So we have added almost about 500 million square feet. And this is just with the LEED rating system and the Griha rating system, which actually counts the number of square feet area. So we have 500 million square feet added. And just to give you a glimpse of what these buildings look like, these are some of the buildings that have been called as green in the last 5 years. So LEED actually stands for Leadership in Energy and Environment Design, which I'm sure you all know. It has originated in the US. So these are some of the buildings. In order to give you a very brief on what the progress of green buildings has been in the past 5 years, we'll show you a short audio visual.
Indian Green Building Council, spearheading the green building movement in India. The Indian Green Building Council, IGBC, was formed by CII in 2001. The vision set by IGBC is to usher in a green building movement in India and to become one of the global leaders in green buildings by 2012. The 21st century green building movement in India was triggered off with the construction of CII, Sorabji Godrej Green Business Center in Hyderabad. One of the greenest buildings in the world. This was the first platinum-rated building outside of the USA and the first one in India. The council today has facilitated over a couple of 100 million square feet of green footprint with hundreds of green building projects across the country. The benefits of green buildings include energy savings to the extent of 30 to 40% right from day one, potable water savings to the tune of 20 to 30%, enhanced indoor air quality, enhanced daylight and ventilation, and higher productivity of occupants. Besides these benefits, green buildings provide an opportunity for climate change mitigation. IGBC Green Buildings reduce 12,000 to 15,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Today, several types of green building projects are being executed all over the country. These include to facilitate the penetration of green building concepts in India and to address the local and regional aspirations, IGBC has launched local chapters in various cities, spearheaded by IGBC champions. The rating systems launched by the Council include the IGBC Green Homes Home Rating Program, IGBC Green Factory Building Rating Program, and Lead India for new construction and Core and Shell. Banking and financial institutions are now offering incentives for IGBC Green Homes projects in India. IGBC is also working on introducing rating systems to suit other types of buildings, covering existing buildings, green SEZs, green cities, green schools and green landscape. These rating systems are being developed to suit the 5 climatic zones of India. Another unique initiative of IGBC is the launch of IGBC Accredited Professionals Exam to cater to the growing need for green building professionals. All major national and international stakeholders are involved with the IGBC green building movement in India. These include in a nutshell, IGBC services include certification, training programs, organizing Green Building Congress, India's flagship event on green buildings, advisory services on green buildings, and accreditation of green building professional. The long-term goals of IGBC is to achieve 1 billion square feet of registered space by 2012 and to have 5,000 IGBC accredited professionals by 2012, besides facilitating the tapping of green building materials market of $40 billion by 2012. Indian Green Building Council, creating a greener India. For more on green buildings, visit www.igbc.in.
So let's look at the second part of the presentation, which looks briefly into the different rating systems that have come up in the last 5 years. LEED, that you already heard of, actually originated in the US. In 1993, David Gottfried, a real estate developer, developed these guidelines and later on formed the US Green Building Council. The World Green Building Council was formed, and the Indian Green Building Council is a part of the World Green Building Council. So in India, the lead has been taken up by the Confederation of Indian Industries, which is basically a commercial venture. So anybody who wants to voluntarily make their building green can apply for this rating. The second one is the eco-housing, which is mainly for the housing sector, has developed also with the help of the USAID and a number of stakeholders, including Rachna Sansad, the Indian Institute of Architects, the Builders Association of India formed a consortium, and they developed the eco-housing rating system for residential buildings in 2005. Very recently, we had the National Rating System of India, known as the GRIHA, or Green Rating for Integrated Habitat Assessment, in 2006. And we had lastly the ECBC, or the Energy Conservation Building Code, which is not exactly a rating system, but it is a code for energy efficiency in buildings, in 2007. Now, apart from LEED was taken from the US, but it was adapted to Indian conditions. It has a lot of reference still to American standards and some international standards as well. Eco-housing is more related to India, and in the latest version, it has 5 different climatic zones in which it is, it provides guidelines. Same about Griha and ECBC also. So if you look at these various rating systems, what exactly do they try to achieve? Their objective, we find that they provide us with either performance or prescriptive based mechanisms to look at green buildings. For example, I can call my building green, but it may not be necessarily green. So we need some comprehensive assessment tools to say that which building can be green, some standardized procedures and norms. It also provides a design checklist. If I am a designer who wants to develop a green building, but I'm not interested in a rating, it provides me with a design checklist. It primarily looks into energy and environmental performance, and it has benchmarks and base cases, and it provides an overall framework to judge the design of a building. And most importantly, it does independent evaluation, so a third party actually judges whether your building is green or not. If you look at LEED rating system in India, it has very similar as in the LEED US. It has 69 total points that can be achieved, possible points, and under 6 major categories. And there are 7 prerequisites or compulsory items. So for example, a building can become a gold rated building even if it's not water efficient or may not have adequate materials and resources which are green. So there are some drawbacks of green LEED rating systems, but it is a very flexible mechanism. It's a third-party certification which has set international benchmarks for green construction, and it's flexible, so people can design it to whatever extent they like to. You can either get a basic certification by just getting 26 points, or you can go more than 52 points and get your building platinum rated. So the first green building, as I said, in India, CII GBC Center, was actually achieved 56 points, which was at that time the highest rated platinum building in the world. Now, of course, the ratings have been adapted and changed. LEED initially started as a commercial rating system because the concern in the US was for the enormous amount of energy and environmental impact of commercial buildings. So we had initially commercial, but now we have LEED for homes, neighborhood development, commercial interiors, core and shell, new construction, schools, and existing buildings. The eco-housing system has a similar structure, which is site planning, again the similar structure, and it has these 7 major categories under which you can get about 1,000 points. But you will see that the weightage given to, for example, water conservation, solid waste management, and energy conservation and management is much more than in LEED, because these are more relevant to Indian conditions, especially, for example, in Mumbai, where solid waste management is a major concern, and also water. In this case, we have 27 mandatory points that need to be achieved, and the mandatory points include not building on eco-sensitive areas and many other things which are very much of concern in India. It has a 5-star rating system, so if you get 500 points, you get a basic certification, and if it is greater than 800, it's a 5-star rating. And then coming to Griha, which has a slightly different structure from pre-construction stage, building design and construction, and building operation and maintenance. It's a very detailed, I would say, rating system. It assesses a building based on its predicted performance. So it relies to a great extent on building simulation, and it advises different types of building simulation tools that can be used for looking at buildings. Again, it has a point system from rating up to 100 points can be achieved. If you're greater than 91 points, you get a 5-star, and if it's just 50 points and above, you get certified as a Griha rating system. Some of the unique points of Griha as compared to other rating systems is that, first of all, it is a part of the government scheme. So it incorporates in it the various already existing norms of the country, like the Bureau of Energy Efficiency norms, the National Building Code, and so on. It's a voluntary scheme. It provides a lot of incentives through the government for the architects and designers, which is very important in a rating system. It is not just commercial and market-based. And more importantly, it has it gives you a certification for a 5-year period, and after that you have to again apply for a rating system. So you cannot just have a building rated as Griha rated, and then it does not remain that forever. You have to keep on uploading. I mean, you have to maintain your green building status. It has now been adopted as a national rating system, and a lot of buildings. We have now an equal number of LEED rating and Griha rated buildings, although LEED started in 2004 and Griha started much recently. The last rating system that we will look at is called as the Energy Conservation Building Code 2007. It is one of the most comprehensive rating systems, and it was established to take care of the supply side energy efficiency part, energy consumption part in buildings in India. As is seen here, buildings contribute to almost 33% of the electricity consumption in India. If you look at the top figure, which shows about the kind of consumption in residential buildings, we see that 34% is just for fans, because a large number of buildings, a large number of people can afford fans, but that single fans contribute a lot of electricity. So it just shows that if you design a building which is thermally appropriate, you do not need that. So ECBC takes care of these things. It provides a lot of incentives. What is estimated is that if and when ECBC becomes mandatory, it is not mandatory at the moment, the buildings will consume 40 to 60% less energy, and they will have an annual energy savings of 1.7 billion kilowatt hour and about 6 billion rupees or $120 million. And that would also lead to reduction of carbon emissions to the tune of 1.7 million tons. So it is estimated right now it is not mandatory, but buildings are adopting it on a voluntary basis. So the objective of ECBC is to provide minimum requirements for energy efficient design. What is also interesting to note is that the Energy Conservation Building Code was designed with the NBC code, the ISHRE, and all the other standards that already existed. It looked at the existing construction techniques and the technologies, and based on that, it also looks at the life cycle cost of the materials used. It gives you U value and the solar heat gain factor, which is not considered in most other rating systems. So it looks at the passive design of buildings, which is what we discussed when we talked about the vernacular architecture of India. Just to show you an example of what the Energy Conservation Building Code looks like, it has two major systems within it. Either you can have a prescriptive method, which means it prescribes to you a certain way of doing things, or it gives you a whole building performance method, which means for the entire building envelope, a certain number or U factor is given, and you have to achieve it by means of simulation, which allows designers to be much more creative. So for example, in the 5 climatic zones on the left-hand side, we have composite, hot and dry, and on the top we have 24-hour use buildings and daytime use buildings. And here it gives the maximum U factor of the overall assembly, and also if you want to look at fenestrations. So as long as you fulfill these factors, then your building can be compliant of ECBC. So if we look at summarizing the green building rating systems in India, the key categories are site planning, water, energy, waste, emission pollution reduction, materials. So if you look at the incremental cost, you might wonder how much do all these things cost. It's very difficult to give you an estimate of how much more a green building would cost, because, for example, if you build, if your design incorporates many features which reduce heat gain, for example, then it would cost you nothing for example, But the IGBC, the Indian Green Building Council, estimates that an approximate of 8 to 10% more than a conventional building. However, the IGBC also states that green buildings consume at least 40 to 50% less energy and 20 to 30% less water with comparison to a conventional building. And so whatever capital cost you have would have a payback between 3 to 5 years. So this is what is estimated, but the figures vary for different types of buildings and what exactly you do. So if you look at the definitions of what a green building is, as per these various rating systems, we conclude that what they're looking at essentially is efficiency of materials and energy resources like fossil fuels specifically, health of and comfort of the inhabitants and the indoor environment, and conservation of nature and biodiversity. But we go beyond this and now look at the third part, which is what is environmental architecture, which is much beyond the rating system. It's a complete holistic way of looking at buildings. It is not a specialization as most people think. It is it integrates the building with its environment. It's more of looking at a self-sustainable unit which has minimized ecological footprint. And it also looks at socio-economic, it looks at cultural aspects and all the aspects of the site which are very important. The different components that we look at in terms of the environmental architecture are climate-sensitive architecture, which is what we talked about, the design of buildings such that the passive actually means that you do not use any active components just to reduce the energy consumption of the building. So that is a very key part of environmental architecture. Use of eco-friendly, it's a common term that is used, but eco-friendly implies materials which have low embodied energy, which are local, which are not toxic to the inhabitants, as well as do not harm the environment in their manufacture and production. They are either recyclable or are already made out of recycled elements. Then we have energy efficient design that we already talked about, use of equipments, lightings and so on, which are more eco-friendly, which reduce energy consumption. Use of renewable energy as an option, like solar panels, wind, hybrid. You can also have geothermal energy. Preservation of natural ecosystems, which is the most important aspect. So when we look at a site, for example, in environmental architecture, for us what is important is not the design, but how the site is preserved. What is its hydrology? What is its geology? What is the kind of vegetation that exists? And how do we create a building on this site without actually destroying much of what exists? That is what ecological landscape design is about, because when we say landscape, the architect usually thinks of trimmed gardens, and typical landscapes come to our mind. But when we talk about ecological landscapes, we talk about natural plantations, indigenous vegetation which can grow on the site without much need of water, and so on. So there's a lot of studies in ecological landscape design that we do. Water resource management looks at rainwater harvesting, looks at water recycling by various methods which do not require energy consumption, and it looks at watershed management as well in sites which are slopey. Then you have solid waste management, that is looking at trash. In Bombay, we have close to 7,000 metric tons of garbage coming out every day, and we require 4 dumping grounds, 150 acres each, just to deposit our garbage. It's a huge amount of wastage, and there's some way we need to deal with it, for example. And healthy indoor environment, also a cause of concern, especially in a lot of the completely air-conditioned buildings where we have the problems of sick building syndrome, which America had discovered in 1970s. So all these aspects we'll now look at with the help of examples, quick kind of case studies. The first one, the passive design aspect. Now this is a building built in 1970s. It's a pharma company. I would like to just show you the features of passive design. There are 2 features that have been used here. One is known as the trombe wall, and one is the wind towers. The trombe wall is a passive heating strategy, and the wind towers is a passive cooling strategy. Now, this is very old design, but it still incorporates all these aspects. So this is the north, so this is the south part of the building, and it is located in Lucknow, which has a composite climate. So we have the Trom wall on the south here, So there is nothing specifically done which is active, but the Trom wall provides heat to the building in the winter, whereas these towers actually provide ventilation, cool air in the hot summers. These are the two principles. The sketches showing what is a Trom wall. So you have a kind of thermal mass here. It's a mass Trom wall, and you have a glass. Usually the mass is painted black on one side so that the heat is trapped here and the heat is later on percolated inside the building. So this is the simple principle of the Trom wall. And here we have a wind tower which actually catches the prevailing breeze and provides it inside. On the other hand, it also allows the hot air to escape on the other hand when there is no breeze. So this is how the building looks like. It might be, very difficult to understand for those who don't know why this building has been, how this building has been designed, that this is the Trom wall system where you see a glass on top of a dead wall. So this is the principle, and it really works. And the people who designed this were all engineers and architects who calculated everything from ventilation rates that are required inside and everything. But it is absolutely possible to design buildings without active systems, and this is one very good example. This is actually inside one of the auditoriums of the building, and they later on put these AC ducts because they were not quite convinced that the system would really work. So the management also wanted air conditioning systems, but you can see it is completely made out of timber, and these are the ducts which are connected to the wind tower, and they provided simple earthen pictures, the pots which were filled with water, and as the air came in from here, it dropped the dust, which was very common in this area, and it provided cool breeze inside. And we have seen this kind of systems work even today in the modern context. So I'll show you some more examples. This is the first government building in India which got the gold LEED rating, and it is the IGP complex in Gulbarga near Hyderabad. Now, this building actually did not apply for a LEED rating system in the beginning. There were two scientists from Indian Institute of Technology who designed the PDEC system, which is the passive design strategy. PDEC stands for passive downdraft evaporative cooling. So in a place like Gulbarga, which is extremely hot and has a composite climate, a PDEC system works very well, and works in the summers, wherein what you have is the towers. You can see these towers on the top, which catch the breeze from all sides, and there is a kind of mechanism wherein it is filtered by charcoal and it is brought inside the building. The sewage in this building is actually recycled using a reed bed system, and it is pumped on the top using solar panels, and it is kind of sprinkled. So inside all the rooms, you actually see this kind of opening. This is rather rudimentary, but it really works because in spaces inside have cool air. Now just imagine that this building is functioning without any air conditioning system. And also they use other aspects like high albedo paints on the outside, use of China mosaic which would reflect rather than absorb light and heat, and a lot of natural light inside the building. So the amount of light that was required, artificial light, was greatly reduced. Now another example of passive design strategy is this example in Bangalore, which uses a system called earth-air tunnel. What is done here is that the breeze is taken from outside, from the prevailing breeze, and it is taken about 1.2 meters below the ground, where the temperature is always stable, and it is then taken inside the buildings. And a very small kind of exhaust fan works here to pull this breeze inside, and it is amazingly cool. And we have seen this work, we visited the sites, and this is actually at the construction. You can see these pipes are actually being laid out to this is a 3-story building, and the pipes go to each and every floor. And you see these openings also at the construction phase where the pipes lead to. So at each house there is a regulator, where the air comes in, and as you put on the regulator, it can also be controlled. And these openings allow this cool air to circulate throughout the house. So the second aspect was use of eco-friendly building materials, and in this we have a lot of options. When we look at eco-friendly materials and how to use them in cities, we wonder what can be done. It's fine to use adobe in villages, but what about the cities? So we have things like fly ash. Fly ash is a major waste which comes out of the thermal power plants, and it can now be mixed up to 40% in bricks and can be used in most of the construction. We have a lot of other ways that can be recycled and used, and which have been experimented already in many buildings. This is an example. This is a case study. Actually, we did one of the sites in Bombay. Bombay is a place where there is a lot of redevelopment happening. There's not much land available, and everything is built on something. You have to replace something. So, for example, in this particular case, the entire house was pulled down, and the new house was made with the pulverized material that came out of the old house. So first of all, we didn't need to buy new bricks, which would actually pollute the atmosphere. The brick kilns produce carbon monoxide. And then we did not have to use fresh topsoil. And most importantly, this material, which would have actually gone to the dumping ground, 25% of that 7,000 metric tons which go into the dumping ground actually consists of debris, building debris. So this actually helped a lot in making this construction absolutely green, and this can be done in most of the constructions in Bombay and many other cities. Use of renewable energy. Of course, solar photovoltaic is still not viable in many parts of the world, many parts of India, but we definitely can use solar thermal, for water heating. And now it is also being considered for, heating can be also used for electricity, directly connected, converted to electricity. So in this particular example, a building in Bombay was provided with 25,000 liters per day. It comprises of 152 tenements, and each one of them had a hot water system which was designed on top of the building. So it can either be done using concentrators or by using solar panels. So this could easily be accomplished. When we talk about energy efficiency in buildings, the first thing that comes to us is lights. And it is very important in environmental architecture to look at life cycle costs. So we look at an example here of life cycle cost. We have an incandescent bulb, and we have a CFL. So the first thing is the average life, which is 1,000 hours. In the case of CFL, it's 10,000 hours. The watts used is 75 watts and 20 watts. The initial cost is, 69 cents and $7. The replacement cost, because it's zero in the case of the CFL, because we have considered 10,000 hours so as a base, so this is multiplied into 10, whereas this is not multiplied at all. And the energy cost. And we put all of these together, we get the life cycle cost. So if you look at the incandescent bulb, the life cycle cost is twice or more than twice that of the CFL. So these are things that ought to be looked at when we talk about energy efficiency. Of course, there's a lot more in this, but I've just given you an example. As far as ecological landscaping, we talk about landscape. This is an example because my students actually worked on this project in a hill station called Mathiran, which was the only lateritic hill station left in Maharashtra, in the state of Maharashtra. And it was fast, this lake, which was the only supply of water on top of this plateau, was actually getting completely, the size was getting diminished. So the students of architecture actually designed various systems of recycling the hotel waste and, providing check dams along the way, rechanging the kind of pathways that existed and so on. And they found ways of, making this lake exist. And this plan was actually adopted by the municipality, the local municipality, and they provided funds for it, and it is being implemented. When we talk about water resources management, I talked to you about water harvesting. Now, this is becoming very, very interesting issue for Bombay, where we are facing huge water cuts. We want buildings to be more self-sustainable as far as water is concerned. So this was also a prestigious project which the institute, the students and faculty designed for one of the best-known companies in India, the Hindustan Petroleum House. And what they did was they provided a complete water management, water harvesting system by which we could extract about 49,000 liters of water every day from the roof and from the surroundings, and store them and use them for the canteen, for cleaning. It will all be filtered and used for the canteen, which it had 2 canteens where it could be used. So this kind of system we have already done in many, many places in Bombay. Water resource management. Now, this is an example of a place in Aurangabad, in part of Maharashtra, which is a rural area. This is a quarry. Now, after the quarry was, left, the villagers actually constructed a dam, which did not cost them much. They used their own resources and labor, and they constructed this dam, which revived the entire hillock. And just by making small check dams and contour trenches, they were able to revive the greenery in this particular hillock. We talked about wastewater management, and this is a system known as DWATS, which is designed by Indian Institute of Technology professor. It's very interesting that the entire golf course of 100 acres was watered using this system. It uses 4 lakh liters of sewage and recycles it just by using plants. And these aquatic plants, by their root system, are able to treat the waste, and it provided fresh water for watering the golf course. Another example of solid waste management is biogas. This also has been implemented. There are close to 20 biogas plants equaling 50 tons of biogas, which have been installed in and around Mumbai. And interestingly, this was also one of the students of our institute who completely, went into biogas manufacture and things like that. But this model of biogas has been very successful, where the solid waste in and around the organic waste from the colony is collected and it is treated and it is converted into biogas. It's also used for electricity in some places. Some other concepts of green buildings. This is a very interesting concept called city farming. Now, most of the vegetables and fruits in cities come from outside of the city, and we do not, we depend on so much of these. There's a lot of carbon emissions. There's a lot of things that happens in the transportation. But here is a very good example. This concept was started by a person called R.T. Doshi in Bombay. And it's very interesting to see that what he did was the entire organic waste of the house was directly used to compost within the plants. So there's a kind of very fast reaction, thermophilic reaction happening here, and the plants would grow in that itself. So there is no soil added to these plants. There's just the bagasse. Bagasse is the agent which helps in the composting process, which is usually available all over Bombay as a waste. So just using waste, a whole terrace was filled with all kinds of plants and vegetables, and this is something that also could be explored further. So urban farming could be done in cities like Bombay. So if you look at the environmental and economic costs, economic benefits of green buildings, we have these various aspects. It enhances and protects ecosystems, improving the quality of life, reducing solid and liquid waste, conserving natural resources for a sustainable future, reducing the operating costs, optimizing life cycle, which we talked about. So that is about green buildings and environmental architecture. And we now come to the last part of looking at the challenges that we face. And we'll quickly look at some of them. First of all, green design must focus on passive architecture. I've emphasized this time and time again, but just let me show you one example just to kind of clarify this, what we're talking about. It was in 2008, we did an experiment, we took 2 buildings, one facing north and one facing east, just for explaining what this concept is. And these 2 apartments were taken similar type, with the same area, with the same kind of fenestrations, with the same kind of air conditioning systems installed in them. And we found, surprisingly, that the energy consumption of the building facing north was on an average around 150 to 200, whereas in the case of the apartment facing east was close to 400, 500, and it peaked to nearly 600 in some months. Now this was amazing. So you look at the 2 different buildings and the energy consumption. The red one is the one facing east. We also looked at outside temperatures, and we found, interestingly, that in both the cases, the outside temperatures, even in the night, were always lower, and the inside temperatures were always higher. That means that the building materials always radiated a lot of heat. So these are things that we look at and we compare with vernacular architecture, and we found how the building materials were kind of different, and they did not allow these things to happen. These are the modern building materials, especially concrete, plaster, and all that is used. We also looked at the human sensitivity, and we found that there are times when people feel very uncomfortable, especially when the humidity rises and the temperature remains almost constant. So this is a very important aspect. We say that buildings must be passive design is the most important aspect in green buildings. The second thing is green must be intrinsic. Today we find that rating systems like the LEED rating system or the GRIHA rating system, they follow a kind of market-based mechanism. Anybody who wants to do it can take it up, but it has not been inbuilt into the laws and the framework of the building bylaws that already exist. So it should be intrinsic, not just in the building bylaws, but also in for example, the educational curriculum. Today, green is like the course postgraduate in environmental architecture, but green must get into the environmental architecture curriculum right from the first year. This is very important. So it must become an intrinsic part if we want to see the vision of sustainable cities and buildings. Green must also address socio-economic issues. So we should not have, for example, a green building standing in the center of a slum area, for example. We need to look at these things more holistically. How do we look at, for example, why don't the slum rehabilitation schemes be also green? Let them also be. It is very simple to do such a thing. So how we can do these things are very important, so that green does not become in isolation. It should be looked at in totality. Materials should be low embodied energy and non-toxic. This I'm specifically referring with respect to the kind of materials that are now used in green buildings. We have a whole new industry. You said you saw in the film the market for green building materials is $40 billion. This is what they aim at. But we are looking at materials which have the lowest impact. For example, the materials that are used now, like glass and aluminum, are most commonly used in the LEED buildings. But what about their embodied energy? This is something that we are not looking at. So there are some examples I'll show you where the embodied energy is far lower. And also, what about the toxicity in terms of when they are manufactured? How do they affect the environment? Green must focus on design and not technology. Technology does give us solutions, but it is not the only solution. For example, the LED lighting systems or the CFLs is a technological answer, but we must go beyond that, because, for example, just take the examples of fenestration or an opening. Way back in 1970s, Victor Olge showed us that just by providing a proper shading device on a glass, you can reduce the heat gain by 1/3 the amount. So just this is part of the intrinsic design of a building, and you don't need any kind of technology for this. Nowadays you have technology of glass saying you have a glass of U value so and so, and so it's an advanced technology. But it all can be simply dealt with a good design. So design is more important, I think, than technology. Most importantly, self-sustaining units. Right now, green is looked at in isolation or in two separate parts. We look at the design of a building, and then we look at integrating green into it, green services, for example, providing wastewater system, providing water harvesting, providing solid waste, providing materials which are correct, and so on. But what we need to look at is as buildings as living organisms, so that they can be self-sustaining units by themselves, so that they have their intrinsically a kind of wastewater system, and all these things can be inbuilt in a system. This is what architects of the future must look at. So we will look at one case study at the end of it. there are in fact 2 case studies. One is that of BCIL, and I'll show you 3 examples of what they have done. Now, BCIL stands for Biodiversity Conservation of India Limited. It's a very it's a very recent organization, but over the last few years, they have added about 1 million square feet of green building spaces in India, and they have hardly got any green rating for themselves. But they have done a superb job of providing real good solid green buildings. So I'll just show you a couple of examples. Most of them are in Bangalore. This is a whole community called Trans-Indus, where you can see the materials that they used. This entire community is built of adobe soil stabilized blocks. And in fact, BCIL today is the largest producer of soil stabilized blocks in Asia. Also, they've used materials like whatever was available on site, the granite stone that you can see on the top, and how they treated the site. None of the existing vegetation was disturbed. On the right, you see here the raised kind of structure in order to see that none of the existing vegetation, even the ground cover, was not disturbed. Then there are passive design systems that they have used, and also added some of the active systems like this, which rotates, and these are the stack effect systems. These are the soil stabilized blocks, beautiful domes that have been created, providing natural light inside. A swimming pool. Who can think of a swimming pool which is good and green? This entire swimming pool does not have any ceramic tile. It's a natural swimming pool made out of the local sand which was available. It does not use. It uses ozone for treatment, and it kind of falls in a waterfall below, so that you do not, and then it is circulated on the top. And it's an amazing natural swimming pool. Another example, the other examples that they have of another community that they have built also in Bangalore, and this is another example. This is a site in the center of a rainforest where they have absolutely, you can see that the stone walls were also built, and they had these columns raised as per the slope of the site, so that they did not have to cut the site. Normally what builders do is to just cut the site and build it. So they built it according to the slope. And last and most important, I wanted to give this example of the Empire State Building because it's closer to you, and this is an example that you would probably relate to. Very recently, the owners of the building decided to make it green, to do an energy retrofit of the building. And there were several people or several groups that were involved, including the Clinton Climate Initiative, the Rocky Mountain Institute, in which one of my students was actually a senior consultant, and he provided us the details of this case study. And they adopted 8 major aspects in order to reduce the energy consumption of the building down to 38% to what it is right now. Okay, and they assume that by doing this, a huge amount of energy savings can be done through even the cost savings can be done. And this just the windows, for example. What they did was the 6,500 windows in this building are all going to be changed just by putting a film inside, and that will reduce tremendously the amount of heat gain that the building now has, because this is a heritage building, I suppose, and you cannot do any major change to the facade. They also put radiative barriers inside, as you saw. So this is an example closer to home, and especially of an existing building, how you can retrofit an existing building to make it consume less energy. And I would like to end with a quotation by David Gottfried, who started the whole building movement here, green building movement. Sustainability is about the 2 most complex systems on Earth, human and living systems. The interrelationship between these 2 systems marks every person's existence and underlines the rise and fall of every civilization. Historically, no civilization has reversed its track with respect to the environment, but rather has declined and disappeared because it forfeited its own habitat. For the first time in history, a civilization, its people, companies, and governments are trying to arrest this slide and understand how to live on Earth. This is a watershed in human existence. So I think this is the most important aspect, that we all together have a joint vision to look at how our buildings, our cities can be sustainable. And if you all have this vision in every possible way not just what I have said, but all the possible aspects of design, then I think not just the architects, but everybody can make buildings green and have a sustainable architecture. Thank you.
Hi. I wanted to know, well, you went through the, I believe it was 4 types of rating systems, and I was just wondering, does that cause a lot of confusion, or like, is there any like inclination to standardize to one rating process?
Not really. The percentage of buildings which are adopting green rating systems is very, very small. And the people who are doing it are well aware of the different types of rating systems. Now, this has also created a kind of new expertise. They are looking for green architects, green consultants, people who are aware of these things. So there's a huge demand created as a result of these rating systems for people who are aware of these things. So as they said, they want to create more and more accredited professionals. So this is one of the things that has happened, but I don't think there is any kind of confusion on this aspect, because it is a very new system, and as I said, they've all come over time, over different periods of time.
My one other question was, when you showed the last few examples from Bangalore, like that was aesthetically amazing and like very integrated with the vernacular that you had shown at the beginning. But I was wondering about a lot of the large corporate projects seem to have this like similar bland corporate, architecture that we have here a lot. So I was wondering if there's any good examples, of where there's been a large-scale project that did successfully integrate vernacular architecture and green building.
As I said, the green rated buildings have just come very recently. The entire BCIL projects, all of their projects they have close to 1 million square feet of green space, but none of it is actually rated. In fact, they recently got one space, BCIL Trans-Indus or BCIL TZ, as a rated system, but otherwise all their buildings and sites are, they do not have a rating, or they are not certified. And similarly, there are lots of other projects which I can show you. I mean, not just in my state, in Maharashtra, but a lot of other places. For example, we have one of the architects we had, Mr. Laurie Baker. He was a British architect who settled in India, and who has produced fantastic kind of local architecture using bricks, and he has devised simple techniques for creating architecture which have low cost, low energy consuming, and so on. So a lot of people follow that kind of architecture, and there are definitely many more examples of really green buildings than what you saw in those slides.
There's a lot of problems with the effectiveness of LEEDs in the US, in that most people would claim it's been ineffective at producing any substantial change in the industry towards better environmental performance. One of the arguments for that is that there isn't any performance validation, that a post-occupancy study or two might be the best you'll get to validate the claims of performance improvements that are largely fictional when the post-occupancy studies are done, and there isn't any ongoing learning built into the context. There's another criticism, major criticism, is the professional structure of the industry, in particularly the architects, who are held accountable. The repertoire of strategies for doing high buildings that actually perform environmentally have been around for a long time. They're not incorporated into the building checklists of certainly the LEED standards, and some of these other standards did look more interesting, but that they don't actually cycle into a professional community the kind of strategies that are really important. And the third criticism is that the architectural profession is imagistic in its systems of accountability, rather than it's not accountable to how the buildings perform, and it's accountable to the clients who pay for their services, who themselves then aren't, there's no demands made of the performance, or the actual validated performance. And so that perhaps what I'm asking, that Leeds has been a tremendous disappointment and extraordinary kind of obfuscating strategy in a sort of actually a real hurdle to doing interesting and bold systems design in the US strategy, in the US context. Is that the case in India? And the second thing is, how does the professional structure of those who are producing or who are accountable to these, apart from getting a few more letters after their names, does it actually change to whom they're accountable to if you've got the same, the same context, the same structure?
Okay, I think in India as well, the LEED rating system has had a similar kind of feedback from most of the architects, students, a lot of non-professionals as well, that LEED is kind of a kind of greenwash, more of a show rather than real stuff. This has been the case. But I think that there is nothing wrong with the LEED certification system by itself. It is a system, and one can use it in the right way or the wrong way, and it's a voluntary system. It provides, as I said, a design checklist for people. Now, as far as the accountability is concerned, yes, there is a problem with it. Like the Griha rating system looks at a 5-year certification system in which every year your buildings will be looked at, just like we have the ISO 14000 in India. It's an environmental management system where every year there is a kind of inspection to see that all the systems are as per the same, they're running in the same way as when you got the certification. So in Griha, we do have this kind of a 5-year re-looking at your buildings, but that does not happen in LEED. And since even the rating systems are advanced, are getting advanced, every version is new. So for example, a platinum rated building may now be gold or silver rated, or even may not be, after 5 years, since there is no checklist or there's no way of assessing again whether this building has remained in the same way or not. So in that sense, I would say it has certain drawbacks, but we have to look at that it is a checklist. For example, you might use this checklist to make a building green without going in for a rating system. But as you can see, in most of the cases here, people who have used this rating have used it because they wanted their building to be called as green. So if they get a green platinum rating, it means something for them in a big kind of medallion or something in the world. It means something. So that is the reason that people have adopted, and most of these have been corporate houses, commercial buildings, who wanted the LEED as a certification for their building. But otherwise, there is a lot of example outside which shows that buildings can be more environmentally friendly. Then they do not need a kind of rating system. But LEED can be used as a kind of guideline. I hope I have answered your questions.
It's the structure of the architect's incentive that is, if you say that the LEED, any of these systems have some limitations, and that architectural design reputations are not made on the basis of a LEED building, and most of the really high-performing green buildings don't have that. So there's a structure of accountability in the architectural profession over which you have some more kind of control as designers that reinvents to whom they're accountable to. And if you're accountable to the cost of production of or your client's budget, you are never going to be accountable to the infrastructure for biodiversity, right? That's always going to dominate. So there's a structure of accountability within the profession over which there is some professional control, obviously, that can change why and how you design, that is not captured in the LEED rating systems and is captured in who pays whom for what and when they and why they're paid in that way, right? And if you can change that, then you can have much more radical and substantial change, which seems to be a place where there can be real professional activism. Yes?
I think, unfortunately, the at least in India, the architectural community, which is guided by the Council of Architecture, has no control over what an architect does with, for example, LEED rating. So they are two different aspects. They don't meet each other. So there is no way of kind of professional accountability as far as the LEED rating system is concerned. The LEED is an independent, kind of guideline for architects, and the architectural community does not necessarily intervene into this.
Your study on the passive systems and explaining how the older cities in India obviously had an understanding of how passive systems work without being able to explain necessarily the calculation of BTUs or specific energy requirements for a building. Obviously, because India is an older civilization, this is an accepted practice that allowed for new green building construction to take on a more natural approach to many of the examples that you used. Based on what the last set of questions was, is part of the challenge the fact that passive systems are not as easily able to be proven in terms of the calculations, and therefore for the example that you used with the wind tunnel, and they decided to have a backup system, was that because there was no proof that the system would work, therefore the developer of the building or the bank was requiring something with a more solid foundation, although history tells us that these systems have worked for hundreds of years, if not thousands.
I think even in the modern buildings, the one I showed about the IGP complex, the police complex in Gulbarga, Hyderabad, where they have used, it's a LEED building which has used these passive systems. What they have done is they have sensors all over the building, and they have in the basement they have a kind of computer system which constantly looks at temperatures inside and outside. And you can always see this difference of almost 7, 8, even 10 degrees temperature difference between the inside and the outside. So they are monitoring these, and it is absolutely applicable. And another thing is, even I don't know about LEED. LEED does not have this provision, but in some of the other rating systems like the Energy Conservation Building Code, there is a whole building performance method or a performance kind of method where a standard is given about what should be the performance of the building, and how you achieve it is immaterial. For example, the lighting power density in a room should be 15 watts per square feet. Now, you may achieve it in whatever manner, but you have to achieve it. That is called as a performance method. Now, this is in the eco-housing rating, we have it in the Energy Conservation Building Code. So it's not that these passive systems are not working. For example, if you provide a proper shading device, or if you have done a design of a building that it reduces the amount of heat gain, so by simulating the building in a computer software, you can actually prove that is what is that this building performs in this manner. That is how you get the GRIHA certification. So I don't think there is a problem with the passive design systems. It's only that we need to somehow relook at some of these systems and concentrate more on the design of buildings rather than just the modern technology and use of modern materials.
I think there's time, if you don't mind, for one last question.
So that was a really excellent talk on buildings. I'm wondering if something similar is going on with city design as a whole or urban planning.
Unfortunately, not not in India. There is. We were discussing today in the class as well. As far as city planning and urban design is concerned, there is still so many compartments. We have the municipality, we have the planning authorities, we have we don't have still an integrative thinking on especially making cities sustainable. This kind of thing somehow, unfortunately, needs to come in most of the cities in India. And that's why you see those kind of cities that have come up completely haphazard, unplanned. There is absolutely need for looking at sustainable planning of cities.